Well, thank you everybody for joining the NCRC's panel on environmental justice and the racial divide, the lack of oversight of toxic sites in minority communities. We have a great panel today, and we're going to be focusing on the impact on minority communities of toxic sites, particularly in the Southeast, with a bit of a focus on the 8 Mile community, which is an African American community near Mobile, Alabama, that's been particularly impacted by a toxic chemical spill from a utility company. And I wanted to introduce our panelists so that you have a sense of who will be speaking before we kick things off with the presentations. You'll first hear from Wilma Subra, who is the head of Subra Company, which is a scientific research company based in Louisiana, which does a lot of work working with communities of color across the Southeast in identifying the scope of toxic issues and trying to work with those communities to see what can be done to remediate the impacts of toxic spills and other environmental issues in those communities. And Ms. Subra is also working with our second speaker, Carletta Davis, who's the head of the We Matter 8 Mile resident community near Mobile, Alabama, that's been impacted by a toxic spill. And she'll speak about the efforts that her community has made to get attention from federal and state authorities and what that community is doing and what their impacts are of the toxic spill on 8 Mile. Ms. Davis is also the NAACP environmental chair for environmental issues with the NAACP, as well as being the head of the 8 Mile We Matter group. Our third speaker will be Marianne Engelman Lotto, who is Deputy General Counsel of the Environmental Protection Agency. And prior to joining EPA, she was a law school environmental clinic law professor who most recently worked at Vermont Law School on environmental issues and is quite familiar in her work as an advocate before joining the EPA on the issues that affect communities of color related to these kinds of toxic spills that we're going to be talking about in toxic sites. And last but not least is Max Lapertosa, who's a longtime trial attorney with the Department of Justice. Max has also done details with the appellate section, the disability section of the Justice Department. And before coming to justice, he was an attorney with Access Living based in Chicago that worked on disability rights issues. And Max, like Marianne at EPA, works on environmental issues and was newly announced that he's going to be the coordinator for the Department of Justice Civil Rights Housing section on environmental justice issues. And we'll be talking a little bit about what the Department of Justice is looking at when it's focusing on these issues. So with that, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Wilma Subra, who will kind of set the table on what the issues are, what she's seeing on the ground in these communities, and will get us going for our panel today. So Wilma, thank you.
Thank you. The health and quality of life of communities of color are being negatively impacted by living on the fence line and in the areas of current and legacy industrial facilities, such as chemical production facilities, petroleum refineries, plastics manufacturing, rubber manufacturing, primary metals processing, pulp and paper mills, wood products, fertilizer manufacturing, and electrical utilities. Also, communities live near oil and gas drilling, production, distribution, export facilities, and orphan and abandoned wells. They also live near areas of surface and subsurface mines, landfills, Superfund sites, and a host of other types of facilities, all of which are associated with the release of very toxic chemicals into the environment in which they live. The toxic chemicals from these sources contaminate the air, surface and groundwater, drinking water, soil, sediment, aquatic and terrestrial plants and animals, and most important, the bodies of the members of communities of color, with the toxic chemicals bioaccumulating in their bodies and causing a large number of negative, debilitating, and fatal health conditions. The regulations administered by federal, state, and local agencies are frequently not adequate to protect the health of communities of color, These regulations are usually not enforced in a timely manner, and the negatively impacted communities of color are not engaged nor allowed to participate in the enforcement process that they need to reduce their exposure and to improve their health and quality of life. Could we have the first slide, please? So we're going to talk a little bit about 8 Mile. In 2008, 6,000 gallons of tert-butyl mercaptan, the oxidizing agent added to natural gas, was released into the ground and groundwater from a tank supply line at the Mobile Gas Whistler Function facility in the African American community of 8 Mile. And you heard about that in the introductions, and 8 Mile is in Alabama. The release was supposedly due to lightning strikes. So is it possible to have the slide up, please? The mercaptan migrated from the shallow aquifer under Whistler's Junction into a deeper aquifer and flowed down dip. 3 years later, in 2011, the mercaptan began bubbling to the surface in the natural springs and groundwater in the Beaver Pond area. The mercaptan was released into the air from the bubbling springs and resulted in residents of 8 Mile experiencing strong odors and severe health impacts, such as nausea, weakness, dizziness, vomiting, diarrhea, difficulty breathing, headaches, lung congestion, confusion, respiratory irritation, kidney damage, and cyanosis, and many, many other debilitating symptoms that degraded their quality of life in the African American community of 8 Mile on a continuous and ongoing basis. The issue of community members' risk was dismissed by the health agencies, and they were left to continue to suffer in their homes. In 2012, the mercaptan still being released into the air of 8 Mile and communities members continuing to be ill, Alabama Department of Environmental Management ordered Mobile Gas to clean up the aquifer. But you have to understand, it does not happen overnight. In October of 12, treatment system 1 was installed, which addressed the mercaptan that was bubbling to the surface in those springs in the Beaver Pond. And you will see that one towards the left bottom of the screen was where the treatment unit was. 3 years later, in November of 15, 24 groundwater recovery wells depicted in blue all along a right-of-way in the center of the figure had been installed and operating. And 4 years later, in July of 19, additional recovery wells were added. And that one has its own recovery system, and you'll see towards the top in the middle of the screen. Mercaptan odors complaints continued to be submitted by 8 Mile community members throughout 2018 and are currently still being reported as occurring in their community. The Porter Ranch neighborhood, a white, middle, upper class community in California, was located near the Alonzo Canyon natural gas storage facility. A well serving the storage facility experienced a major leak and released 100,000 tons of methane with some mercaptan into the atmosphere. The community members experienced headaches, bloody noses, nausea, rashes, and brain fog. 8,000 families were relocated out of the area, and the risk was due to the potential for the methane in the air to explode. Thus, residents were relocated. Could we have the next slide, please? The Dresser facility in Pineville, Louisiana, manufactured industrial valves and components, and their process included degreasing metal components using trichloroethylene, or as most people know it as TCE. In 2016, Dresser was performing investigations to determine groundwater contamination. The chemicals contaminated the groundwater and extended off-site. Based on continuing ongoing investigations, it was revealed that Dresser had both groundwater contamination and soil gas contamination with TCE, with also PCE and breakdown products, daughter compounds that extended from their facility into the residential area. On January the 8th of 2020, just before the pandemic hit, Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality hand-delivered notice letters to the residents of the middle and low-income Aurora Park, which you see in the major part of the screen with the industrial facility at the top left. And as a result of that, the notice letter stated that environmental contamination had been detected in the vicinity of your property or your residence. Historical salt, groundwater, soil gas contamination from industrial solvent was dissolved and discovered at the Dresser facility. The main contaminants, TCE, PCE, were present as well as the breakdown products. The notice stated sampling of indoor air will be conducted in some future time period. Can you imagine receiving a letter hand-delivered to your door that makes those statements? The Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry established health-based guidelines for ambient air concentrations of TCE 2.1 micrograms per meter cube and PCE 3.8. When the indoor air results exceeded either one of those guidelines, granular carbon air purifiers were installed in the homes. In this situation, there was a risk, but the risk was addressed when the air purifiers to reduce concentrations of TCE and PCE and their breakdown products, not eliminate, but only reduce. Therefore, no evaluations were even performed to determine how long in the past history had they been exposed. And then communities in Aurora Park were provided with health impacts. TCE, headaches, dizziness, sleepiness, immune system effects, increased risk of health problems in the developing fetus, like heart defects, problems with the immune system, which make babies prone to infections. TCE causes kidney cancer in workers and induces liver cancer and malignant lymphoma, while PCE causes headaches, dizziness, sleepiness, harm to nervous system, reproductive system, liver, kidney, and unborn children, causes memory, attention, and vision loss, and changes in the mood and reaction times. Next slide, please. And can you imagine what those people living in Aurora Park felt? So then in November of 2020, the results of groundwater and soil gas contamination at 5 additional subdivisions and housing developments around the facility were released by Dresser. The groundwater contamination plume had been identified as having migrated into more upscale areas, north, northwest, southeast, southwest of the Dresser facility. And in March of this year, notice letters were hand-delivered by DEQ to property owners and residents in the Greystone Road area. The letters notified the individuals of the groundwater contamination, the soil gas contamination, and said, we'll be coming to sample the air in your homes. Dresser is only performing in situ chemical oxidation and soil extraction on source areas on their property, not within the community. And from all the plumes that you see there, it's under huge number of individual homes. These are just a couple of the types of negative exposure and associated health impacts due to toxic chemical exposure in communities of color. Frequently, regulatory agencies tend to dismiss the situation occurring in communities of color and lack efforts to provide oversight in order to ensure the industrial facilities are complying with the environmental regulations. Industrial facility sources that negatively impact communities of color tend to overlook the negative impacts caused by the facility operation and assume the communities of color will never, ever speak out. Going forward, there's a need to engage, educate, and empower communities of color so they can participate in the process of reducing their own exposure to toxic chemicals and address the unacceptable situations that are occurring in their communities. There is an absolute need to empower community members so they can represent their situations to local, state, and federal environmental health regulatory agents represent the situations and negotiate changes with the industrial facilities causing the negative impacts to their community and their community members, and most of all, provide mechanisms so community members can help other communities with similar exposure situations. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilma. And before we turn to our next speaker, Carletta Davis, I would just mention that the NCRC is working with the 8 Mile community, including Carletta Davis, we filed a complaint on their behalf along with the South Alabama Center for Fair Housing for the companies that were involved, the utility companies that were involved, failure to redress or deal with the impacts on the minority community there, as opposed to, as Wilma mentioned, there's the white community at Porter Ranch in California, which was relocated because of a toxic spill there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carletta Davis, who's going to talk about 8 Mile in particular and the impacts on her and her fellow residents of that community. Thank you, Carletta.
Thank you, Brad. And I appreciate being a part of this very important discussion. And going forward, I hope that we have more discussions such as this. As Wilma was saying, oftentimes communities such as 8 Mile or voices are not heard or they are ignored when companies come in to our communities to do their business. And what we find often is, and I know I can speak for myself, having lived through this, I live about a quarter of a mile away from the actual spill site. And my family was heavily impacted by the odors and the chemical that inundated our community and has inundated our community for years. My children have suffered health conditions. I have suffered health conditions. We've had the nosebleeds, we've had the headaches, the nausea, the high blood pressure, and all of those things that were described as I guess, conditions or as effects of the chemical. So we've been through all of that. But prior to this happening to us, as with most community members like myself, we were just going along our daily lives. You know, we were not focused so much on the environment. We were not focused so much on who our corporate neighbors were and what they were doing. And so because of that, I feel that communities like ours are targeted because we are so busy with the rat race of life, if you will, and just trying to economically survive, socially survive. And so environmentally, we're not paying attention. And so when people ask me about 8 Mile, I always tell them that I became an environmentalist by force and not by choice. And the reason why is because this spill just was imposed upon our lives in the way that it was. And so someone had to do something about it. It became very clear and apparent to us after the quote unquote lawsuits that were filed that there would be no true remedy or redress to what happened to us and what the company had done. There would be no real punishment given to the company for doing it. And so therefore we had to take matters into our own hand, which is what we did. And so about 2016, we began to organize as a community. That was something that we had never done before. And we came together and started to say, okay, we've got to make some noise. And particularly because we heard about what happened in Porter Ranch and the fact that this was the same company and that they had gone out and literally removed those residents from the spill location in order to keep them safe. And so we were like, well, what is the difference between our community and their community? Why is it that they get to be safe? Why is it that their children's health is important and our children's health is not? And so it really emboldened us to again organize and just started. We really literally got into the street and started petitioning the health department. We started petitioning the environmental department, Alabama Department of Environmental Management, and our governor. We marched on Montgomery. We went to the Capitol. We marched on the federal building downtown because we knew that we had to bring attention to what was going on, or else it was just going to continue to get swept under the rug. And so, you know, we've continued that fight. Our hope is that the federal government now will take a deeper look at what has gone on and the injustices that we have suffered because of this spill. If 8 Mile has about, I would say, 6 landfills just in this area. And it's not a big area, you know, so we have really environmentally taken the brunt of all things negative when it comes to environmental, I call it environmental injustice in Mobile County. This area has the most landfills. We have the most area for industry as far as like the gas pipes and things of that nature. And so, you know, now we're just really, we're really super focused on one, what's going on with the companies that are here. Two, you know, who's wanting to move here and why, and what are they going to do? Because we don't want to be caught in a situation like we've been caught in with the gas company. This is our homestead. We've been here 30 years, and we don't want to go anywhere. It's a beautiful area. It actually used to be the bedrock area of Mobile County. Had beautiful springs where people went fishing and swimming, and you know, and now again, you know, these environmental disasters it's just destroying our community. And so these types of things, as I understand it now, are happening all over the country. And you know, our hope is that communities such as ours get a voice and get an opportunity to go directly to the federal government and have the federal government to actually impose and to oversee what is going on in these communities. Because oftentimes our state and local officials are just checked out. They're not involved. Either that, or these companies are paying the for political favors, which sets the policy for our communities. And so because of that, they don't set the policies in favor of the community. They set the policies in favor of their donors, which are these companies. And so, you know, we need to actually have a voice where we can go directly to the federal government and say, look, this is what's going on in our community. And we really need you to come in and oversee what's going on and to make things right. And, you know, oftentimes I feel like there's no face to what's going on. And so therefore, I felt it was very important for me to be a part of this panel so that people can actually see that we are real people. You know, we have hopes and dreams. We want to live the American dream just like everyone else. You know, we want to be in good health like everyone else. And it is unfair that our communities have to suffer the brunt of these companies coming in and just polluting our communities for no reason, and for us to have to suffer because of it. And so, you know, there are these are real situations and are real people. And, you know, the more that by me becoming the president of the community association, of course, I got the opportunity to hear firsthand from my community members all of the horror stories of children that were having seizures and, you know, having to have, you know, surgery, brain surgery and things of that nature because they were being exposed to this chemical. And so it just breaks your heart to know that, you know, these kids their lives are going to forever be changed because someone made the decision to come into our community with a chemical and spill it and not tell us. And so, you know, there's just got to be more humanity put behind what's going on with these companies, so that this doesn't continue to happen. There's a way for business and community to live together and be together. We're not anti-economic. We're not anti revenue growth. We're not anti-job growth. That's what all of us want, but we also cannot enjoy those things if we're not here to enjoy them, or if we're in bad health, or if we're always having to take off of work because our kids are in bad health. So there's got to be a medium where community and corporation can live together and be together and not hurt one another. And so I'm hopeful that with these types of discussions, that path becomes a reality.
Thank you very much, Carletta. Appreciate that. I'm now turning it over to Marianne Engelman-Lotto, who's Deputy General Counsel at the EPA, and just joined the agency within the last 6 to 8 weeks.
Thanks so much. It's an honor to be on this panel, and I'm to both Wilma Subra and Carletta Davis. It's familiar, all too familiar, but also still heartbreaking to hear about your experience. Environmental justice is such an important topic, and it was at the core of my practice as a lawyer before joining the EPA, but it's also the motivator and why I'm excited to share why I have joined the administration. So what I wanted to do with my few minutes is to tell you a little bit about my background, and through doing so, talk a little bit about environmental justice, and then talk about why I have some reasons for hope. As I hear Ms. Davis's story, it is a classic story of civil rights, unfortunately, but a story, an experience of local and state government. The feeling is of not being responsive to the community. And this is really what drove the civil rights movement, the need for the federal government to come in because rights were not protected. So my starting point is that environmental laws have absolutely made a difference, and enforcement of environmental laws is critical. But having said that, as Wilma Subra suggested, there are significant gaps. Given the history of racial segregation and the footprint of how land is used across the country, and the fact that our patterns of living are still marked by race, it's not surprising that race would be a salient factor in predicting how polluting facilities are located, where they are located across the country, within states, within counties, within towns. Who has access to fresh air? Who has access to clean soil? Who has access to clean water? To go back and take our lens a little bit broad for a moment, in 1987, the United Church of Christ's Commission on Racial Justice released what is now considered to be a seminal report called Toxic Waste and Race, which examined the relationship between the location of hazardous sites, including income, other factors, and race, and found that race was the most salient factor in explaining the location of hazardous facilities. Again, not surprising, given how the footprint of the legacy of segregation and discrimination in this country. Since that time, the literature on this issue is substantial. I would commend 2 articles from about 2014 or 15 by Robin Saha and Paul Mohai called Which Came First. One is a literature review on the relationship between race, income, and other factors and exposure to hazardous substances. And the other is itself a longitudinal study, or reports on a longitudinal study, which asks the question, do people move to toxic sites, or do toxic sites move to people of color? And while there's a little bit of both, it also turns out that, as Ms. Davis was saying, unfortunately, it's the case that if you look across time, that toxic facilities move to people of color. This research and the experiences of communities across the country tell us that racial disparities in exposure to pollution continue today. Once formal racial segregation was declared illegal, we as a society failed to re-examine access to environmental benefits and burdens, and we failed to address those inequalities. Again, just because we've taken off the line saying this area is Black, this area is white, or this area is Latinx, this area is white, doesn't mean we've uprooted the zoning, the location of pre-existing facilities. They're still there unless we take conscious decisions to say, oh no, no more are we going to put another facility in this already overburdened community. In fact, we live with some communities overburdened by the cumulative impacts of many sources of pollution. I think of Newark, New Jersey, Richmond, California, Gary, Indiana. And we even exacerbate those inequalities by allowing more facilities to be located or to expand in already overburdened communities. A community I worked with and had the real honor of working with in Alabama, Uniontown, Alabama, in Perry County. I see Ms. Davis is nodding her head. She's familiar with it. Uniontown has catfish plant, cheese plant, an antiquated sewage system. And then there was a permit for a very large landfill. And then there was a decision to allow coal ash to come to this very large landfill right across from where people are living. That's the cumulative impact of an already overburdened community, a community that has a per capita income of about $10,000 and that is about 90% African American. So we can apply principles of environmental justice and civil rights to these situations, and it is on all of us in the private sector and the public sector, at the county commission, at the state level, and the federal government to do that. So what do I mean when I'm talking about environmental justice? I look to the First People of Color National Environmental Summit that gave rise to a set of environmental justice principles, which I commend to people, that affirm values such as the sacredness of Mother Earth, and they demand justice in the distribution of environmental benefits and burdens. Polluting facilities, as I said, are more likely to be located in BIPOC and low-income communities. And those communities are more likely to be exposed to pollution, whether it's a particular chemical or particulate matter that gets in the lungs. And now we know also that BIPOC communities, low-income communities, and people with disabilities also face higher risks associated with climate change. Even more urgently, more recently, we know from COVID-19 hospitalization and death rates that people of color, particularly Black or African American, non-Hispanic persons, Latinx folks, and American Indian or Alaskan Natives are something, depending on which community we're talking about, just multiple times more likely to be hospitalized and to die from COVID. And we know also that one of the contributing factors, this is from a Harvard study, is the relationship between being exposed to particulate matter, which gets in the lungs, and hospitalization and death rates from COVID. And we know from an EPA study in 2017 that there's a very strong relationship between race and exposure to that particulate matter. So we need to do something about that distribution of environmental benefits and burdens. And the environmental justice principles also call for procedural justice, respect, a say for communities in affecting their own future. So my work before coming to EPA was to work with communities and provide legal assistance, technical assistance to support the kind of organizing that Ms. Davis is talking about, or that was occurring in Uniontown. We worked with community groups to assert their rights all across the country. And I had the great opportunity to work and be honored by trying to support the community organizing that communities were doing. I actually was not in an environmental clinic, I was in an environmental justice clinic. And a lot of good environmental work is done in environmental clinics, but we were training students to work with and support communities. And the theory of change was that it is communities that will take control over their own future. So why did I make the switch to the government? And maybe in Q&A, we'll talk a little bit more about what opportunities that presents. Well, President Biden during his campaign was the only candidate that I know in the history of candidates in the United States that actually had a really elaborate environmental justice platform that included enforcing civil rights in the environmental justice sector. Civil rights enforcement is not where it needs to be across employment discrimination, housing, but it is somewhere. Whereas in the environmental context, report after report, experience after experience has shown that people simply do not expect, the regulated community does not expect to have to be held accountable for discrimination in decision-making in the environmental sector. So we're going to change that. And we've got the administrator of EPA, Michael Regan. We've got the president of the United States, Joe Biden, who are behind that. And in executive order after executive order, there's executive order 13985, advancing racial equity, executive order 14008, tackling the climate crisis. They've reiterated the need for civil rights enforcement. They're calling on us to audit ourselves to ensure we're advancing equity, and they're taking concrete action to advance equity. And again, I hope we can talk more about the specifics and what you all can do to ensure, to hold our feet to the fire, to let us know what your positions are, and our doors are open. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our last speaker is Max Lapertosa, and given the importance of the Department of Justice and the civil rights history of this country in working on these issues, we wanted to make sure that we included Max in the discussion, particularly because the civil rights housing section at the Justice Department is focusing on environmental justice issues, and Max is the point person on that issue for the civil rights housing section. So with that, I'll turn it over to Max for his remarks.
Thank you, Brad. So Marion's comments are a perfect segue into what I'm here to talk about, which is the Civil Rights Division's new environmental justice initiative under the Fair Housing Act. As Brad said, I'm a trial attorney in the Civil Rights Division in what's called the Housing and Civil Enforcement section. We enforce 5 federal civil rights statutes, but the bulk of our work is under the Fair Housing Act. We have both our section and I think the Civil Rights Division generally historically comes to this with the least experience of anyone on this panel, certainly in environmental civil rights cases and environmental cases generally. We are hoping to change that, as Marion said, because this is a priority of the current administration. So as litigators under the Fair Housing Act, we litigate a variety of cases: race discrimination, gender discrimination, sexual harassment, disability discrimination, religious discrimination. But we have not historically focused on environmental cases or environmental justice cases. And so there's a deficit of experience and knowledge that we're hoping to fill with this new initiative. The initiative came about because of the executive orders that Marion just described. On January 20th, President Biden's first day in office, he issued an executive order calling on the federal government to advance environmental justice and hold polluters accountable, including those who disproportionately harm communities of color and low-income communities. And a week later, the President issued another executive order that directed federal agencies to develop programs, policies, and activities to address the disproportionate health, environmental, economic, and climate impacts on disadvantaged communities. So in furtherance of those directives, the Housing and Civil Enforcement section, where I work, created an initiative in which we will use our authority to enforce the Fair Housing Act to advance environmental and public health policies and practices that discriminate in housing primarily on the basis of race, color, and national origin. Some potential examples of those are what Marion has already talked about, the citing, whether currently or historically, of industrial or pollution-causing land uses in neighborhoods that are majority persons of color, decisions concerning municipal services that are traditionally tied to housing, such as water, sewer, electricity, that have had negative environmental impacts on people of color. And again, because this is a new area for us, I don't want to make the examples exclusive. We're open to looking at a number of different examples. So for example, many years ago, we filed an amicus brief in a case where a highway was being widened and it was going to negatively impact a low-income housing development that was majority minority in Georgia. So, we want to hear about cases like that as well. I want to talk a little bit about what the Fair Housing Act prohibits and what our authority is under that statute. The Fair Housing Act prohibits the discriminatory refusal to sell or rent housing or to otherwise make housing unavailable or to otherwise deny housing on the basis of race, color, or national origin. And the otherwise make unavailable or otherwise deny language is very important because what that means is you don't have to be a landlord or a provider of housing or a condo association necessarily to be liable under the Fair Housing Act. You are liable if you do something that ends up making housing unavailable. The Fair Housing Act also provides that discrimination in the terms, conditions, or privileges of sale or rental of housing, or the provision of services or facilities in connection with housing on the basis of race, color, and national origin is also illegal. And that gets us to some of the services that may not be tied directly to the sale of rental of housing, but are certainly part of what we expect when we have housing, like clean water, electricity, and so forth. One barrier that has come up that is not specific to environmental justice cases, but certainly impacts them, is the question of whether the Fair Housing Act applies to what is called post-acquisition discrimination, meaning discrimination that occurs after a person buys a unit or rents a unit or otherwise takes possession of the unit. And there has been a split in the circuits, and there's an unfortunate decision in the Fifth Circuit from 2005 that was actually in an environmental justice case that held that those claims, with a few exceptions, are largely not actionable under the Fair Housing Act. One thing I can say that the Civil Rights Division has done, and it spanned administrations, was fighting that very narrow definition of the Fair Housing Act and making sure that discrimination that occurs post-acquisition is still actionable under the text of the Fair Housing Act. And even where that theory applies, where environmental conditions basically make housing uninhabitable, the courts have said that we can pursue a constructive eviction theory, meaning that it may not be an actual eviction that in the way we think of that, but if the housing is basically unusable because of surrounding environmental impacts, that is a violation of the Fair Housing Act if it's based on race, color, and national origin. The Fair Housing Act recognizes two theories of discrimination in the context of race. One is intentional discrimination, the other is disparate impact. Intentional discrimination, in my experience, is largely misunderstood. It is a tougher theory than disparate impact because you have to prove that the discrimination occurred would not have occurred but for the race, color, and national origin of the residents of the housing. That, of course, does not mean that that has to be the only cause of the discrimination. There can be multiple independent motives that concurrently led to the discrimination. But we nevertheless would have to prove that the defendant would not have acted but for the race or color of the residents of the housing. It can be shown through either direct or circumstantial evidence, so there doesn't have to be a smoking gun. And then the final thing I would note, which is often misunderstood by defendants, is that intentional discrimination is not the same thing as animus or hatred of specific groups. So it is intentional discrimination, for example, if a municipality allowed for industrial land uses to be sited in a minority neighborhood, not because they didn't like the residents, but simply because that's just politically easier because of their race. That would be intentional discrimination based on race, even though it may be that none of the decision makers were themselves personally prejudiced. Disparate impact is a theory that does not require a showing of intentional discrimination. So, for example, if we can advance that theory, even if there isn't evidence to show that the discriminatory impacts of a decision occurred but for race. And it was recognized, it was recognized as a viable theory by the Supreme Court under the Fair Housing Act in the case from 2015 called Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus Inclusive Communities. So that's a second benefit of the Fair Housing Act because, as some of you may know, under Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which is a law under which other environmental justice cases have been brought, private citizens cannot sue under a disparate impact theory. In 2001, the Supreme Court decided in Alexander v. Sandoval that a Title VI regulation prohibiting disparate impact discrimination for federally funded entities, while the regulation is still valid, it cannot be enforced by private citizens in a lawsuit. So that is no longer true under the that is not true under the Fair Housing Act. However, inclusive communities put some caveats on disparate impact cases. The main one being that statistical disparities alone between groups of different races cannot in and of itself prove a disparate impact claim. The disparities have to be tied to a specific policy or practice or ordinance that caused the disparities. And if that's the case, then there is a prima facie case for disparate impact discrimination. The second caveat is the Supreme Court imported from other civil rights laws, mainly employment discrimination laws, a defense that's commonly known as business necessity. In the context of a Fair Housing Act case, even if there is a disparity, it will pass muster under the Fair Housing Act if the defendant can prove that it's necessary to achieve a valid interest. And finally, I want to talk about our authority to sue under the Fair Housing Act, because while it's broad, there are certain limitations on it, and that affects the type of cases that we can accept. So except where HUD refers a case to us, where we're looking at an affirmative civil rights lawsuit under the Fair Housing Act, the Department of Justice generally has to show one of two things: either that there has been a pattern or practice of discrimination, or two, and this one's a little more complicated, a denial of rights that affects a group of persons that raises an issue of general public importance. And I'll unpack that in a moment. But what's important to understand is that either of those two theories can support a lawsuit by the government under the Fair Housing Act. We don't have to show both. So a pattern or practice, which is a term that's common among civil rights laws, means that the discrimination that's being challenged is the defendant's regular policy or procedure. It is not merely an isolated, sporadic, or unusual act. A discriminatory law or policy that applies generally is almost always going to be a pattern or practice. So most disparate impact claims that are viable are probably going to be pattern or practice cases. And that is regardless of the number of times the law has been enforced. So oftentimes we've had defendants argue that they may have a discriminatory policy on the books or a policy that has a discriminatory impact, but they haven't used it that often. But that's not how the courts have interpreted pattern or practice generally.
So Max, I think we might have to leave it there for now, so we have some time for questions and answers. But Appreciate all the comments. I would only add to this portion of the program that the previous administration basically sat on the 8 Mile complaint that we filed on behalf of the residents there for more than 2.5 years. And then only in the last 6 months of the Trump administration did HUD begin to look at the issue. And then in literally the last month of the administration, HUD no-caused or found that there was no substantiation for a claim that there was disparate treatment or disparate impact in the 8 Mile community in the way that utility companies handled the complaint, handled the leak. So we have moved the Biden administration, we've moved for reconsideration and asked the administration to take a deeper look at the 8 Mile situation. So with that, I'm going to close out this portion of the panel, and we'll open it up to questions from those in the audience and from the panelists. And I wanted to thank you all for this fascinating portion of the event. Thank you.
Okay, my name is up, but my picture is not. I can deal with that.
So I think we're up on the screen. We're having some technical difficulties getting Roma connected, so sorry about that. But we'll go ahead and get started. And we taped this panel about 3 weeks ago, so it was nice. It was interesting to see it again 3 weeks later, and I think it covered a lot of good ground. I wanted to start with you, Carletta, and looking at the questions from the audience that came in during the playing of the tape. There were several people asked what recommendations you would have, given the experience that you've had with 8 Mile, your personal experience, on like what worked in organizing the community to get the attention of state and federal authorities, and what didn't work. What's your advice to other groups in this situation? And you're on mute. You'll have to unmute. Sorry.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you for that question. And that's a very loaded question, in that I think that most of these corporations bank on the fact that the communities are not as well organized and they don't have as much political clout as other communities do. So, what we found is that, number one, you just got to get started, right? You just got to organize a team that will be dedicated to making sure that the community is notified of all meeting times, notified of what's going on in the community. One of the things that we didn't do well, I think, early on, was we didn't get enough people involved in the planning process because it became quickly overwhelming. Like when we had to do our health assessments and things of that nature, we would have 2,000 people show up, and we didn't have enough people taking the information. So I just think from the very beginning, you just need to get a good group of people that will be dedicated to keeping the community informed. Definitely leverage political, your local political leadership, and making sure that they're informed as to your meetings and making sure that they're buying into what you want to do, and start early on. Start before you have a problem. We came in after the fact. I do believe that one of the things that Alicia Canyon had to their advantage was that they already had their community organization established before the spill happened. So I would say organize prior to having an event.
Okay, thank you. Marion, wanted to ask you, we talked about we have opportunities here, given the new position you're in. What are those opportunities, and what can groups like the 8 Mile residents do to help you more effectively do your job, to tee up the issue for agencies like the EPA?
Well, that's a big question. So I'll try to take it in turn. So first, I think this is an exciting time, not only in the federal government, but around the country. We have data like we've never had before. Communities all over the country are doing their own community-based science, which provides information that wasn't available before about air quality and water quality. We have mapping tools in many states, not in Alabama, but in many states, often supported by state governments, that help us identify where cumulative impacts are the greatest on communities, that help us to really zero in on what's going on. The prime example of that is CalEnviroscreen, but there are something like 20 states that now have these mapping tools that mobilize data for us. We have information about the connection between redlining historically and segregation historically and where we are today. So I say all that because all the work is not happening at the federal government. That so much of the work is happening in communities and in states to push all of us to recognize these connections between historic segregation, redlining, what's happening today, and what data we have available that can be used in decision making. I think it's an exciting moment in the federal government because the president has put some muscle behind this. Some of the initial executive orders are telling the whole government, look, you got to look yourself in the mirror and evaluate, do an audit of whether or not your programs or activities are advancing equity. And we're all doing that. We're engaged in that process right now. And so what can communities, and one other thing I just want to say, given the nature of this conversation, is I am very excited to be working with people in the federal government right now who really want to make transformative change. And that's not only my fellow colleagues who have just joined the government, but people within the government, career civil servants and others. And a good example of that is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the failure over many decades, not just the Trump administration, but many decades, to fully enforce Title VI and to implement the promise of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act in this area. And so we will be and are rolling up our sleeves and figuring out what we can do differently, how we exercise our affirmative authority to do investigations, what data we should be taking, how to hold people accountable. So there's a lot going on that's really exciting. How can people get involved? Well, first, I want to just acknowledge that people are already doing things that are extremely helpful. They're already engaged in community monitoring. They're already filing complaints. They're already organizing, as Carletta Davis has described. That's all very helpful. That raises the profile of the issues, that makes it known that change needs to happen. So that's really important. I would also encourage people to participate, and I know people have many priorities, so I don't want to put a burden on people, but we have public processes, both for rulemaking and also right now the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council is meeting. They're meeting this week on Thursday, and those are public meetings. Engage, submit comments, let your voices be heard so you will have an influence on what we do. And of course, contact us, let us know what your opinions are. And that will also lift up the work that we need to do for transformative change. Those are only some of the things that pop to mind right now.
Thank you. Hey, Wilma, I'm sorry you're having technical problems, but can you hear me? I think you're on mute right now. Wanted to ask you, Wilma, you're on the ground in Louisiana, and you're working with a lot of these communities and looking at the science, looking at the impacts. What advice do you have in terms of gathering the data and to make a case locally that Marian talked about? Like, what would you suggest to people like Carletta who are organizing their communities and trying to gather the facts?
So when the community has an issue and they start organizing, frequently they know they're sick. They want someone to come in and make them well. But the idea is you have to have enough other information to then go to your local, state, and federal agencies, environmental and health agencies. So that's the kind of work I do on behalf of the communities, is educating them and empowering them with the information they need to put together to then interact with not only other communities and other areas, but to interact with the agencies and bring that information to the agencies. And over again, we found as soon as we start introducing that data to the agencies, they start positively responding to the issues associated with that community and where the exposure is coming from. And then they do what they can to help identify further, whether it's the chemicals, whether it's the media, whether it's the air, the water, the groundwater, the soil. And so all of a sudden you have the interaction between the agencies and the communities. And frequently the communities get frustrated because they think it's not happening fast enough. But as Marianne just talked about, this new administration has opened up a lot more doors. And we all have to work together to put that data together and then work forward to address the issues that that data tells us about and reduce the emissions and reduce the exposure. So I can always say, I'll help you identify the situation, then I will help you reduce your exposure.
Thanks. Hey, Max, Wilma talked about opening doors. How do we, given the limitations under the Fair Housing Act? I mean, it's a powerful act, but there are judicial limitations that have been imposed more recently by some of the courts. How do we open doors with the Department of Justice to be able to take action? What kind of documentation and substantiation can groups bring to you that's helpful to open those doors?
We have a complaint portal through the Civil Rights Division's website where anyone can come in and file a complaint, and it gets forwarded to the appropriate section, depending on what law is implicated. Of course, a lot of people in the advocacy community who know us better come directly to the section that they know enforces the law. So there's no requirement to go through the portal. It's just designed to make it easier for the general public to report complaints to us. But you can always write to us directly. It's not a formal administrative procedure where, like the EEOC, for example, where you have to go through certain procedures. Anyone can come to us and email us any information they want. If you go on our website, you'll find the email address, our general email address, as well as the name of our section chief. And if anyone has a fair housing environmental justice complaint and it has information or evidence to back that up, they can email it to us. They can FedEx it to us. Regular mail's probably not such a good idea because that's very slow. But I would just say reach out and provide us whatever you have.
Okay, thanks. And I note that Marianne had mentioned to me in our portal for the conference that there's an EPA listserv as well that you can join, which is www.epa.gov/environmental justice to join. And we can post that separately as well. Carletta, I want to turn back to you. In the next couple of years, what are your hopes for your community? What do you realistically hope that you can achieve or that the government can do to help you both locally and federally in the next couple of years?
Well, my hope is that the community has really learned the lesson and that we don't become complacent again, and that we remain vigilant, and that really that the federal government will kind of come in and undergird us with the policies that Marianne was talking about and the efforts, so that when we have incidences in our community, that we have an avenue to go to. Quite often through state politics, communities like ours are not the ones that are deemed to be the most politically astute or have the most political capital. And so it's because of that we need a direct avenue directly to the federal government from the community. There needs to be a way that, we lodged a complaint with the state and we do those things, but if we don't get results, like it's been now over 10 years that we've been dealing with this, So if we don't get results, we need to have an avenue to go directly to the federal government and say, hey, this is what's going on. We need you guys to come in and enforce and inspect as to what's going on. So those are the kind of things that I hope comes about from the federal government, just the undergirding of these communities. And again, that our community, factions are really deadly when it comes to situations like this. And what we experienced early on was there was a lot of factions that happened because private lawyers came in and got different groups of people within our communities on different lawsuits. And so they were all told not to speak to each other. And so therefore the community was not united. But as long as the community is united, then they can fight together, they're strong together, and their voice is heard. And so my hope is that, we don't become fragmented, that we are fragmented, and that we continue to stay united and stay on the journey of getting true justice for our community.
Marion, a question for you. Given that this concern about fragmented communities and what can one community do to learn from the lessons of another in working on environmental justice clinics? What can communities do to band together to stand on the shoulders of work that's been done by other communities to not make those same mistakes or waste time, perhaps?
One of the things that's so exciting about working in the area of environmental justice since the late 1980s is that communities have been learning from one another. When the people who were at the first People of Color National Environmental Leadership Summit in 1991, report that often they felt very isolated, as if this feeling of being dumped on, the sense that state and local government is not responsive, felt like it was only their problem. Why in West Harlem do we have the bus depot and the multiple sources of pollution, and now the sewage treatment plant and stuff? And that felt very local. And then someone in Uniontown thought, why do we have all of this? And then someone else. And what that did was bring people together into this formal environmental justice movement. So one way of overcoming that isolation and learning from one another is to be in touch with other groups who are doing this work. And there are many ways in which that happens. There are groups of, there used to be something called environmental justice centers, and that idea has a rebirth right now. And I think of Beverly Wright and Bob Bullard and Beverly at the Deep South Center, working with other historically Black colleges and universities to provide support to communities, particularly in the coast area in the South, the Southeast, so that they can learn from one another. I think of the clinic, the kind of clinic that I was at Vermont Law School, the Environmental Justice Clinic, and there are other environmental justice clinics at University of Miami and at Golden Gate, the oldest one in the country at Golden Gate, and some others who provide support and technical assistance precisely as Ms. Davis said, so communities can lift themselves up, but have that extra support. I think of other resources, and at the federal level, part of the reason that it's helpful, I hope, to share the EJ listserv is there are things going on at the federal level. They're not perfect. We're re-examining the barriers. We're trying to figure out what we can do better, but there are small grant programs. There is this, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, the NEJAC, and now there's a White House Environmental Justice, the WEJAC, and those have open meetings. So there are opportunities not just to be talking to the federal government, but to be listening and learning from one another. And there are now conferences and other opportunities, which paradoxically may be a little bit more accessible now that we're online because you don't have the cost of travel. So there are downsides and upsides. But I think there are a lot of ways to band together. Just one more plug before I stop, which is there are regional and statewide environmental justice. They're sometimes called networks. They're sometimes called alliances. And like the North Carolina NCEJN, North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, with the great Naima Muhammad as the executive director and lead organizer, or there's a North Carolina, there's a New Jersey, a New York environmental justice network, and they bring people together on a regional level to share information and strategize. So that's a good, and there's one in California, that's a good mechanism to consider. In Alabama, for example, where there are a number of different groups that are working on these issues to come together and to form a network and really try to learn from one another and strategize on an ongoing basis. So that's sort of an exciting thing that's been happening for the last few decades.
Well, thank you to all our panelists. We're out of time, but this was a great discussion. The dialogue will continue. NCRC is going to continue to be involved in the Amal case. We're continuing to work with our members if they have questions about environmental justice issues to connect them with the right resources and just to continue the connectivity that we need to advance on this issue. And it's great that we have people in the administration like Max and Marion who are working on these issues now. So hopefully onward and upward. And thank you again, panelists, for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.